Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK week number 4 overview, analysis, and of course at the end, my updated power rankings. LCK is always at least a little bit interesting. Not as many upsets as maybe you would like, especially compared to a lot of the other regions where right now it feels like so many teams are just not able to establish any sort of continuity. It very much does feel like there are, the top teams and the bottom teams in the LCK for better and for worse, but I think that should give a lot of confidence to LCK fans that their good teams are actually pretty damn good, and I do believe that despite what they were showing at MSI. And so let's go ahead and go over what happened in week number 4. Of course, let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of this week, what teams are over or underperforming your expectations. I always love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback down below, even if it's disagreeing with me, actually. In fact, especially if it's disagreeing with me. I love to hear other opinions down below, so let me know. And of course, any discussions are going to be great. A little bit of an aside before we jump in here. Linked up in the iCard right now is going to be a little bit of a poll that I put out a couple of days ago. I will be unavailable for a couple of days, about 4 days over the course of next week, and I was just curious what you guys wanted me to do in terms of being able to make up that content, or perhaps the content that you want to see when I get back. If you want to go and vote in that would be fantastic. Of course, if you don't particularly care when these videos go out, then, that's all right. But if you do have some interest, let me know down in that poll. So I appreciate that. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the video. Today, of course, we're going over the LCK, and what we do if you're new here is we're going to go game by game, talking about all 10 series that happened in the LCK this week, giving a player of the series and a dud of the series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. And then, of course, at the end of the week, I'll be giving my updated power rankings as well as a player of the week and a dud of the week. So without further ado, let's kick off day number 1 with a matchup that honestly was one of my more intrigued matchups of the week. We had Hanwha Liiv Esports taking on Dplus KIA. And DK is going to be able to pick up the 2-0 win. Now, obviously, there's some, question marks surrounding the series in general. We were really excited to see Hanwha versus Dplus KIA just in general, because these two teams have very much felt on similar patterns, I would say. They're both kind of fighting it out for 4th place right now in the LCK, but Hanwha Life obviously going through some things off the rift at the moment. Clid is out, Grizzly is in. I talked about the Clid stuff in last week's video. If you want my thoughts on that, obviously go to that. Quick summary, good. Like, if he's, gonna have any problems, there's plenty of talented players in the League of Legends ecosystem. We don't need to keep players that are bad off the rift. There's really no room for that, and so Grizzly stepping in here, although clearly, not the same level as Clid, and I think this team definitely lost some early game shot calling in particular, because that was a really big weakness for them in this series. We'll talk about Grizzly when we get to them, but DK looking very good in this series. I've, kind of been on this DK train. I've kind of refused to jump off, even though they really haven't been all that consistent over the course of this year. I've seen a lot of people drop them to number 5, number 6 in terms of their power, maybe not number 6, but number 5 in terms of their power rankings. They've stayed strong at number 4 for me, basically all split long, and I think for now they're going to stay there definitely with this win over Hanwha. The consistency that they show is just a little bit higher, and I think their upside is a little bit higher as well. But player of the series was pretty obvious for me. It's going to go to Showmaker in the mid lane. Very quietly, he's been one of the best players in the LCK this split. He can be a little bit up and down. There are going to be some series where he's not as impactful as others, but when he's given some champions that can be more proactive, and when the rest of the team isn't losing super hard, he actually does look very good. And I think, honestly, he's become a little bit underrated, which is crazy to say about Showmaker, who is, maybe a top 5 player at his peak all time, right? Like, when you're talking about best players in their prime, Showmaker's probably top 5 in that conversation. And it's kind of crazy to say that he is underrated in that vein, but I really do think that people have kind of stopped talking about how good he is. He's an MVP candidate for me in the LCK this split. He really has been that consistent. And, Tristana, for its credit, is also rising a lot in popularity. Talked about this a bit in my LPL video a couple of days ago, but that pick is super fun, and it's really freaking strong right now. As a Tristana player myself, that is really, really good, especially on this patch of 13.12. It's a very, very good mid lane pick, and he definitely showed that with the aggressiveness, being able to be kind of enabled and really unlocking the rest of the map. He looked fantastic. So, ups to Showmaker. The top side of this map in general, I just think was really good. Canyon was awesome on 2 games of Ivern, another champion that's going to rise a ton in popularity on this patch. I don't think it's like as busted as maybe some people would like to say it is, but certainly when you have really good carries, Ivern can make it basically impossible to be able to deal with them, and that's kind of what happened with the Tristana in both of these games. And then Kana was actually really good this series as well. Definitely better than Kingen. People have been pretty critical of Kana, but I think generally speaking, he's still been fine. Maybe not one of the best top laners in the league or anything like that, but certainly a serviceable one, and one that you can win with, and he was really good on the Renekton in particular in game number 2. Still good on the Poppy in game 1, but it was the Renekton game I think that stood out. Deft and Kellen, ironically enough, were probably the weak links of DK, which have just not been the case over the course of this split. They've been pretty consistent, especially in the early laning phase, but they didn't necessarily need to be big deals in this series. Top side of the map was winning, and I think DK did a good job of enabling kind of their big carries to get them across the finish line. And then for Hanwha on the other side, a rough loss, but it's kind of excusable, right? You know, Grizzly coming in obviously didn't have a ton of time to practice with the rest of the players on this team before he was just kind of thrust into the lineup, and, you know, he showed it. He showed that he wasn't particularly super ready for this. He wasn't looking all that great. I want to cut him at least a little bit of slack because, again, really tough shoes to fill as much as we can shit on Glid and say that, you know, he was really inconsistent. He was the primary shot caller as far as we know for this Hanwha Life team, and so to take him out and just insert a rookie, it very much felt like this team had a ton of disconnects, and a lot of these players ended up playing a lot worse than they normally do. Dud of the game, or dud of the series for me, is going to go to Zeka in the mid lane, just completely outclassed by Showmaker on the other side of the map, and, you know, some of his build choices, they called it out on broadcast, were a little bit questionable. You don't really want to build Demonic on Azir. That's a very weird path. It doesn't really give you the damage or the survivability. You want to go, you know, either or, and then it felt like Zeka went neither, and he was pretty useless this game. Kingen was completely outclassed by Kana in the top lane in both games on the Jax, which is pretty unfortunate, and like I said, Grizzly really didn't have any sort of impact. It felt like he was late to a lot of plays. It felt like he wasn't really doing the things that he needed to do in order to keep this team alive. Viper continues to play really well, but there's only so much he's going to be able to do. He was outplayed by Showmaker towards the back half of these games, just getting picked off basically as soon as the fight starts, and then from that point, Hanwha has literally no players that are up to the task. And so for Hanwha, it's not a surprising loss, especially considering the roster change, but I predicted them to lose even with their full roster. And so to see them go down pretty quick in an 0-2, it's not crazy shocking to me. And then it's good to see Dplus KIA playing well. Obviously, you wish they would have done it against a team that did have their full roster to kind of prove that, okay, you know, this team is moving in the right direction, but they've been better than people have given them credit for all split long. They've just been inconsistently good. And so hopefully this is kind of the start of them building on that consistency and getting to a point they feel more comfortable with. And then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and it was a matchup between KT Rolster and the Kwangdong Freecs that KT Rolster is going to be able to take in a 2-0 sweep, and a pretty dominant 2-0 sweep. Game 1 was a little bit back and forth. There were certainly moments where KDF looked okay, but their nemesis comes back to bite them, and that nemesis is Nico, which is just, it's been a problematic pick for KDF to play against basically the entire split. I've talked about it on this channel, but it really became a problem in this series. Game number 2, it was a lot more than just the Nico, but game number 1, it really felt like they had absolutely no way to deal with it, even with some of their best players on some pretty proactive picks. And so let's go ahead and talk about it. KT Rolster's player of the series, no-brainer, going to go to BDD in the mid lane. He still is playing really well. I know he's kind of lost some of the spotlight that he was generating in the spring split. He was legitimately a top 3 player in the LCK. He was an MVP finalist for me in the spring split. The only player not on T1 to be an MVP finalist for me in the spring split. And, you know, I know some of that shine has kind of moved away because Keen is playing so well here in the summer split. He's kind of been the quote-unquote MVP candidate on KT Rolster. Lehen's obviously also been someone that's, I think, gained a lot of traction, but BDD is still really freaking good, especially when you give him something that can be as proactive as the Nico was here. We talked about it being KDF's kryptonite, and he performed incredibly well. Crazy that this didn't get banned out in either game, but BDD definitely took advantage, and he looked great. He plays off of Cuz incredibly well, and he's just been really, really good across this entire year. To see him be better than Bulldog by this significant of a margin, it's massive for the rest of the team, so good stuff from him. The other player, obviously, is Lehen's, that you do want to shout out for being really good this series. The Nautilus in game number 2 was super fun to watch, but man, it just feels like he's so unlocked on this team. We talk about how, you know, maybe you don't want Lehen's all the time, right? Like, Lehen's as a player can sometimes be a little bit feast or famine, and he has been that in the past for some teams, like his time on Afrika. But, you know, on this KT Rolster team, I think that it's really just been almost all positives. Aiming has taken more of a secondary role on this team, and I think that that's good overall because you have such strong carries in Keen in the top lane, and then BDD is a great secondary carry, but he also loves to have resources as well in the mid lane. Aiming's kind of been the odd man out in terms of, like, the pressure, and I think that's helped Lehen's kind of be that creator, be that facilitator, be that playmaker anywhere he needs to be on the map, and that's really unlocked him. He's arguably been the best support in the LCK this split, and it's been super fun to watch. I was worried that leaving Gen.G and leaving that environment would be a problem for him, and absolutely has not been. Keen was basically irrelevant in this series, which is good. I think overall for KT, it shows that they can win super hard without Keen, but aiming was really, really good. Again, I don't want it to seem like Lehens was the only one in the bot lane who stepped up. Aiming had one of his better series in a while, or at least one of the ones that was more noticeable. The bot gap in this series was ginormous, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but Cuz was good. Basically, everybody on KT stepping up, especially in that game 2, which was just an absolute throttling. And then for KDF on the other side, I think everybody really wants this team to be good right now, and they are good. Like, I shouldn't say that they're not good, but they're not great, right? They're not a team that is going to be able to compete with any of the top teams in the league, and I think this is kind of the performance that shows that, because even if they do have talent here, I like Dudu a lot. He's probably my favorite player on the team. I like Bulldog. You know, he's a really good young player, even if I'm not as high as maybe some of the other people are in the community. Youngjae's fine in the jungle position. This bot lane is just a black hole of pressure for KDF. They've been a massive problem all year long. I think you can make a solid argument that they are the worst bot lane in the LCK. It's between them and Brion, in my opinion, and I would honestly take Brion. I would take Henna over Taiyun. I certainly would. I think it gives you more consistency. I think Taiyun and June have just not been good. Taiyun's going to get my dud of the series here. You could give it to June on the rel in that same vein, but Taiyun stepping up and just completely outputting 0 damage is just so disappointing to watch, and it's frustrating because I think everybody knows that this KDF topside could actually be relatively good, but I don't think you're ever going to be able to win a consistent amount of games with this bot side. Like, maybe you can be a top 6 team with the fact that teams like Liiv SANDBOX are really struggling at the moment. KDF is certainly in the conversation for that, and they've been around 500 basically all split long, but I just can't imagine them being much better than that, especially with the amount of top-end teams that there are in the LCK at the moment when their bot lane is playing like this, because Taiyun and June were just massively negative for them. Youngjae was fine. Honestly, I would argue that he was probably the best player for them in this series, but that was only because he was making the least amount of mistakes in my eyes. Bulldog just got run off the map by BDD in terms of pressure. Dudu was really doing nothing this entire series, just losing in lane to Keen, which again is excusable because it's Keen, but it's not like he was actively helping his team. It just felt like KDF was outclassed basically in every aspect, and again, it's not particularly surprising, not because I hate KDF, but because KT Rolster is really good. They've proven the consistency at this point. They moved to 6-1. This is one of the best teams in the world, and I think a lot of people are really excited to hear that. And then moving on to day number 2 now, and we get to kick off day number 2 with the matchup between my number 1 and my number 10 teams. In my power rankings, we had Gen.G taking on OK BRION. And Gen.G does pick up the 2-0 win, but it is certainly not a clean 2-0 win. This was a very close series, despite, I think, what, you know, a 2-0 would initially lend you to believe, and despite the fact that it was the undefeated Gen.G versus BRION, who really has not been able to win a series to save their life ever since that DK series. And so we can go ahead and talk about it, but I do want to give a lot of credit to Bro basically right out of the gate. A couple of these players really stepping up. There is a substitution for them. Ivory is back out. Karis is back in. Ivory really was not performing all that well in the mid lane. He was not stepping up. He certainly wasn't able to handle a lot of the top mid laners in the region, which is a problem in the LCK, considering I would say half of, if not more than half of the region is elite caliber mid laners. And so Karis is back in here, and you know, we'll talk about him. He was actually really good in this series, did a lot of really good things, and so interesting to see if he maybe got some of his confidence back when he took some time off. That'd be interesting to see. But for Gen.G, they continue to just be able to outskill their opponents towards the back half of games. When we go back to what we were talking about for Gen.G in Spring Split, when we were a little bit lower on them, when we weren't considering them, you know, the best team in the LCK, one of the best teams in the world, etc. A lot of the reason that we were not considering them that is because their early games were a little bit weak and their late games were really strong. We saw them as a team that continued to ramp as the game went on and were great in team fights, made really good decisions, and were never really out of position, always were in games. And this was kind of a throwback series to that mentality, where their early game was relatively inefficient from multiple members of the team. I still really like what players like Chovy were able to do, getting out and moving around the map. I still think Peanut was relatively active, but Bro did a good job being able to keep up with them in both games. It really was the late game decision-making and the late game team fighting that really separated Gen.G in this series, and I think that is still a good sign. It's still going to be this team's bread and butter, and I think a lot of that goes back to my player of the series in Pace, who really is just that kind of player, right? He's good in lane. Like, I don't want it to seem like he's a bad laner, but Henna and Effort actually did a really good job being able to keep up in lane in this series. Even on the Aphelios in game number 1, can be a rather difficult matchup for the Kai'Sa, especially when you've got something like the Gragas as the support. A very weird matchup there to have to play out, and Henna, I think, played it incredibly well, so Pace actually really wasn't dominating the lane phase like you would hope, but his ability to stay in games and be super proactive towards the back half and just generally be the most positive player for the team, I think is incredibly underrated. He was super big for Gen.G down the stretch in both of these games, and he's honestly been great for them the entire split. split. I was talking about how I wasn't entirely sold on Paze as like a full 100% complete player after spring split. He was a top 3 or 4 AD carry in the LCK for me going into the split. He has basically destroyed that ranking. He's an MVP candidate for me, and he's been great. Chovy has also been phenomenal for this team in the mid lane, and he continued to be really good. Like I said, continued to stay really active, which I think is the biggest positive that I can give Chovy. So many people complain about him just sitting in lane and farming up and yada, 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 right? He's not that player anymore. He's going to be active. He's going to move around the map. Him and Peanut are constantly teaming up to try to make plays. Sometimes it's in his lane, but a lot of times it's moving around and trying to make them at objectives. And so really like what Chovy was able to do. Peanut played well. Doran obviously had the really funny pause because he was like, why is my static shiv not working on Quinn? He didn't buy it. And so kind of a funny little situation there. But overall, Gen.G I think played relatively well. Paze and Chovy continue to be like master carries for this team, two of the best players in the entire league, and the rest of this team is definitely good enough as ancillary pieces. Delight and Peanut in particular I think have really stepped up this split. And it's not like Doran is a slouch or anything. He was definitely the better top laner, and so good stuff from Gen.G. And then for Bro on the other side, they tried their best. They really did a lot of good things here. Henna in particular I thought actually had a really good series. The Aphelios in game 1 was really good. The Callista in game 2 was really good. Interesting to see him pull that out. It's something that I think has been historically pretty good into Ashe, and I really like that matchup, and especially with Ashe rising in popularity. Pretty interesting to see it again, especially with things like Alistar becoming more meta. And so Henna being able to pull it out and actively being, positive in the early game and being a good factor for this team, I think is really good. Karis more than kept up with Chovy in the early parts of the game, was able to match CS and was trying to match Roams, especially on the RE in game number 2, but just kind of difficult. Chovy was definitely dictating the pacing of the laning phase, even if Karis was trying his best to keep up. And then my dud of the series is going to go to Morgan in the top lane. He wasn't particularly awful. I just think he was the one player that was involved in the least amount of good plays for Bro, which is going to happen sometimes out of the top lane when the rest of your team is doing relatively well and being proactive and trying to make plays. Sometimes as a top laner, by the time you get to the team fight phase and your team is losing, you're going to look, the worst of the team. And I think that's more of what happened to Morgan in this series rather than him individually making major mistakes, although I do think some of those team fights were pretty poorly played overall. But for Bro, it's the same story that it's been for quite a long time. They are able to keep up, I think, with quite a few teams in the early game, but they just do not have the team fighting ability, and especially do not have the macro towards the back half of the game to actually keep up with any of the average teams in the LCK. And that really is kind of the crux of a lot of teams at the bottom of the standings. Nongshim's kind of like that. KDF is kind of like that. I think Bro definitely falls into that category as well, and we kind of saw that again in this series. And then for Gen.G, they're really talented, but really they're just an incredibly smart team. They know how to play the back half of the game. They're very consistent, and I think that's going to lead them to a lot of wins as they go throughout the year, and they're going to continue to stay undefeated coming out of the first part of their week. And then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and it's a little bit of an upset as we saw DRX taking on Liiv SANDBOX, and DRX is going to be picking up the 2-1 series win. SANDBOX continues to just look incredibly underwhelming. We've been looking for reasons to lower this team out of the top 6, out of the playoff spots in terms of the power rankings, and there really just hasn't been a ton. Their schedule's been relatively difficult. They've really only played the best teams up until this point, and they've been able to handle teams like Nongshim and Brion, which gives me, the confidence, at least up until this point, that they were better than, the middle tier teams in the league. But DRX may be proving that that is not the case, as they are not a middle tier team in the league. They have been pretty bad and pretty inconsistent, but a couple of the roster changes that they've made in recent weeks might be stepping up to help them cross the finish line. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Fate in the mid lane. He really looks reinvigorated, revitalized after this break. He was really bad in spring. It felt like this DRX team was basically a carbon copy of Nongshim from 2022, where it was a lot of interesting players that just were never going to figure it out as a unit, and all of them underperforming their individual talent level. But Fate was always someone that I was a little bit lower on in terms of what he was able to output at the LCK level, so I wasn't particularly surprised to see him underperform. But, he got a little bit of a break. Yehu came in and played mid lane at the start of this split. He wasn't great. He really wasn't awful, but he wasn't great for this team, and so Fate ended up coming back in along with Juhan, who I assume had been practicing together, and Fate's actually been really good ever since coming back in, or at least a marginal upgrade over what Yehu was for this team, and I think he was really impactful in this series in particular. Watching him play Tristana as opposed to watching Closer play Tristana was actually mind-boggling. Closer was miserable in game number 2, just completely giving himself up, dying on repeat over and over again, and, we'll talk about the rest of the series. He was certainly hit or miss on the Aurelia as well, but Fate was really, really good towards the back half of the series. The Jace was fun in game 2, and the Tristana was great in game number 3, and that's really why he's getting player of the series. I think a lot of the other players that people are going to point out, Rascal in the top lane, who continues to look relatively good when the rest of this team looks good. He's just so streaky this split. Again, I've been pretty critical of this like narrative that Rascal is quote-unquote hard elo stuck on this team, because I do think it kind of takes away from the idea that Rascal himself has not been playing very well. Like, yes, I do think Rascal is a very good player, and yes, DRX is a bad team, and Rascal probably would be doing better on a better team, but it's not like Rascal himself has not been the cause of some of the losses that they've been having, but he's kind of getting back into form here as I think the team is starting to gain some confidence, so good to see that from him. And then Beryl, a much better series in general from Beryl. On the Rel in particular, he looked really good. Even the Heimer in game 2 was solid, but the Rel in game 3 was really fantastic. This is probably the first series all maybe year long for DRX where I was like, Beryl looked good, and that's a good sign. Like, at the very least, he's looking good. Paddock is still a maniac, but he's toned it down just a tad bit, and then Juhan definitely looks to be a little bit more cohesive, and certainly not as int heavy in the early game as what Krako was offering, even if I don't think he's like a superstar or anything. So for DRX, all they really need to do is, you know, kind of be above the worst teams in the league, and if Liiv SANDBOX is going to be as bad as they were in this series, then DRX, I think that's a mark that they can probably hit. And then, like I said, for SANDBOX, they just do not look good right now. There really is nothing to say. They probably shouldn't have even won game number 1, although, you know, there's definitely some questionable motives when it comes to that, but games 2 and 3, like, they definitely were worse. They had a chance to win game 3, but a lot of that was really just kind of superficial, in my opinion. It was all Bertle in the top lane, who, yes, was really good. I want to give him a lot of credit, and he was definitely, in my opinion, the best player for SANDBOX across this entire series, but the rest of this team absolutely not stepping up. My dud of the series is going to go to Kale. As much as I love him and as highly as I rank him as a support and as a player, he's really not been all that good in summer. He's taken some major steps back. I'm not sure if that's just him and Teddy's style not necessarily, you know, working well together. Teddy's had that problem with certain supports in the past. He's had some really good support, you know, synergies as well, but he's had some bad ones. I think he plays a very specific style, and some supports work with that. Some supports don't, and Kale, I think, has looked a lot worse because of it, but his confidence feels very shaken right now. He was just consistently looking for flanks in game number 3 on the recon and basically never actually engaging or peeling for the enemy team, which is very frustrating, but you don't have to make the highlight play every game. It doesn't feel like Kale knows that at the moment. And then I think mid-jungle has taken a pretty big step back from spring as well. I've always been low on closer. That's actually kind of a channel theme over the last few years, is people getting mad at me for how low I am on closer, but I still think he's just kind of an okay player, and he was definitely outplayed by Fate towards the back half of the series. Despite the good plays that were made on Aurelia, he was also kind of inconsequential towards the outcome of that game. And then Willer in the jungle, I think, has taken a major step back from what was a really good spring split. So frustrating stuff for SANDBOX. Hopefully they can figure out like what they're doing, because you just don't want to see this team fall off super hard. But right now they don't even feel like a remotely close to top 6 team. Losing to DRX is a miserable loss for them, and it's going to drop them quite a bit in terms of my perception. And then for DRX on the other side, it's really nice to see them be able to pick up a win, but one win is certainly not going to turn around my perception of this team. There's a lot that needs to be done in order to make me feel better about them, and, you know, this is just one series, although Fate is performing well, and hopefully you can get some confidence under Rascal. That's going to start a nice solo lane duo for them, and then if the bot lane can just be serviceable, I think DRX can at the very least be competitive this split. And then moving on to day number 3 here in week number 4, and we kicked off day 3 with a matchup between KT Rolster and NS RedForce that KT Rolster is going to be able to take. It's a quick and easy week for them, quite frankly, and really, I think that's the exact thing that you want to hear if you're a KT Rolster fan. You're tired of these up and down weeks where you face, you know, so-so competition and can't get the job done, but, you know, make it look really interesting when you play against the best teams. You're tired of the up and downness if you're a KT fan. It's just nice to see a series against what is maybe the worst team in the LCK at the moment in NS, and, you know, play really, really well. Just dominate them, you know, go home early and be done by day number 3. That's exactly what you're looking for as a KT fan, and it's exactly what they delivered. They've been so good and so consistent over the course of the beginning of this year. You just have to tip your cap to them. Player of the series for me is going to go to Lehens in the support position. We've been talking a lot about Keen and BDD, and even Cuz to an extent being like the big outliers and the big proponents of this team being really good for KT Rolster so far in summer, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention that Lehens just might be their best player, or at least he might be performing the most consistently as their best player. Keen is certainly, you know, kind of the one who is taking the crown in the media's eyes right now, and for good reason, but Lehens, I think, has been playing out of his mind. Like I said earlier this week, I think he might actually be the best support in the LCK LCK at the current moment. He really is playing at that level. The engaged support meta has definitely helped him get back to his playmaking ways, and he's been really, really fun to watch on a lot of these champions. The Rakan, the Alistar, basically anything you could ask for. He's going to get my player of the series here because of those fantastic engages. Again, it's not just him that's doing a lot for this team. You can definitely make the case that BDD could be the player of the series here for them. He was continuing to be fantastic. Of course, he had a great series earlier this week, another good one on 2 games of Annie here going into Fiesta, who, again, was reinserted back into the lineup last week for Nongshim after quad. Just really wasn't getting the job done. BDD made it look like he was not the answer. That's all I'll say. We'll get to Nongshim in a second, but BDD looked fantastic in this series. Keen went deathless in the top lane. That's absurd. Aiming went 13, 2, and 20. He looked amazing. Cuz had jungle pressure all series long and was definitely the better of the 2 junglers. KT Rolster was just so dominant in terms of what they were able to output, and they're one of the best teams in the entire world right now. They're so much better, in my opinion, than what they were in spring. They feel like so much more of a complete team at the current moment, and honestly, there's really not a lot stopping them from being the #1 team in the LCK if they keep this up. And then for Nongshim on the other side, a couple of positives, but mostly negatives coming in from this team. Jiwoo continues to look really interesting in the AD carry role. He's been really fun to watch. He's a pretty aggressive player, but he doesn't get himself into as many bad situations as maybe other AD carries that are aggressive. You know, someone like a Paddock would in the LCK. I think he's significantly more coordinated with what his aggression looks like. I think on a better team, he would actually look a lot better, but playing Varus, playing Ashe on a Nongshim team that doesn't really have any pressure anywhere else on the map, it's just going to be very difficult. My dud of the series is going to go to his lane mate in Peter. I really liked Peter. Obviously, I was a big on the Peter hype train about a year ago. We were putting him in thumbnails. We were really doing a lot with him, but I think he's gotten a full shot here on Nongshim, and unfortunately, he's just not been able to live up to his short stint that he had in the LCK last year, where he was actually pretty good for this Nongshim team. Obviously, talent around him has been relatively different, and the bot lane has definitely been, in my opinion, the positive of this team, or the biggest positive of this team, but Peter's going to get dead of the series. He was just super outplayed by Lehens. The rel was just not working, and there really weren't any good engages. I think you could realistically give this to Sylvie in the jungle as well, who is very quickly becoming one of the league's worst junglers, if not the league's worst jungler at the current moment. Fiesta certainly hasn't solved their woes in the mid lane. Din Din in the top lane, I've always been lower on. I just don't really see the upside when it comes to him as a player. Nongshim is just not a very good team at the moment, and it's a lot of different things, right? We've talked about them in the past being probably the worst macro team in the LCK, and the worst macro team that the LCK has seen in quite a long time, and I definitely stick to that. I definitely still believe that they fall into that category, but individually, they've started losing a lot more. This isn't KDF, where, yeah, you know, sometimes their macro throws away games towards the back half, but they're really interesting mechanically. This is just a team that really doesn't feel like they should be in the LCK. That's really frustrating, I think, for a lot of fans. They are competitive in the sense that I think that they can beat some of the worst teams in the league, but they've looked by far the worst of any of the teams that are, you know, kind of in the bottom against the best teams in the league. So for Nongshim, I just don't have a lot of confidence that they're going to be able to turn it around. Do they have talent on this team? Yes, I really like Jiwoo, and I loved Sylvie and Fiesta in the Challengers League, and Peter as well, but it just has not been able to translate, and clearly it's not working. But for KT, it clearly is working. Things are very much going their way right now, and you've just got to be, I don't want to say the E word, right, but you've just got to be excited about KT and what they're doing at the moment. Hopefully they can keep it up. You know, if they have a late season slump, I'm not going to be entirely surprised because it is this organization, but this team has definitely proven a lot more than they have basically at any point in the past couple of years. And then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and it's a pretty classic matchup at this point here in the LCK, as we had T1 taking on Dplus KIA. And T1 is going to be able to pick up the win here in this series. And again, I know that they've been struggling as of late, and there are a lot of things that you can point out that they haven't been necessarily as dominant on in this split as they were in the spring split, or even really last year, but there still very much is a top 3 in the LCK, and I think that they proved that in this game. There are a lot of teams that I think are very much up and down in terms of the form that they have, and DK is definitely one of them, and T1 is able to dispatch them in 2 relatively clean games. A couple of moments from DK that looked relatively interesting, but T1 was definitely the better team here. It's kind of crazy But it's funny to note that DK actually hasn't beaten T1 since Worlds 2021. That's a pretty insane stat, but it just goes to show you the amount of domination that T1 has had over the LCK just in general, and they continued that in this series, even if it hasn't exactly been the best of summer splits so far, especially compared to expectations. But my player of the series for me in this one is going to go to Owner in the jungle. He was phenomenal on 2 games of Viego. This is a champion that alongside Lee Sin has very much become something that I associate with him as a player. He's been very good on it, very consistent over the course of many, many years, and he continued to look really good in this one. Canyon has not necessarily been in the best of form, but still, it's always an impressive feat when you're able to just go into a series and be significantly better. Poor Canyon tried to play Vi in game number 2 into a LeBlanc, into a Viego who can cancel it, an Alistair who can cancel it. You know, Gumayushi who's sitting behind everybody, Zeus can cancel it. Like, it had to be absolutely miserable playing that champion, but Owner was a big reason why. He was getting resets very consistently, and even if the Varus wasn't exactly super present in the fight, or maybe if the LeBlanc wasn't super present in the fight, he was still more than enough to be able to take over and carry this team to a win. He was far from the only player to play well, though, in my opinion. You also have Keria in the support position, one of his more complete series in quite a while. He's definitely not been on the spring split pace where he just dominated and was the clear choice for MVP for the entire league. He's still been very good, and this bot lane has still been very good, but Gumayushi has honestly taken, I would say, more of a, main focal role in this team and in the way they want to be structured, and I think Carry has taken a backseat because of that, but this series was definitely a little bit more Carry. A very good Rel game in game number 1, very good Alistair game in game number 2. Just a lot of action and a lot of pressure going bot lane for T1. And I definitely think that does benefit Keria in general. He's always liked to have a little bit more pressure from his jungle or from his mid laner, or just from the map in general, and I think that he definitely took advantage of that here. Guma continues to be really good. His spacing is absolutely nuts. He's still mechanically fantastic. Zeus dominated the top lane matchup. He was significantly better than Kana, and Zeus has honestly been really good across most of this split. I know people aren't going to say that, but Zeus is still one of, if not the single best top laner in the world, and, from game to game, that's what you're getting. He's going to have bad performances here and there, and hopefully he's going to be able to show up in the big time, but, in the regular season at the very least, I don't have any sort of concerns about him as a player. And then you have Faker in the mid lane. He was, ironically, probably the weak link of the team in this one. He's been phenomenal throughout this year so far. I think he's been a big proponent of why T1 was so good in spring. He was another finalist for me for MVP in spring, if you guys remember. But just a couple of plays on LeBlanc where he was getting caught out in side lanes or getting caught out before fights, basically for no reason. Obviously there's some news that's come out about Faker in the recent days that has certainly changed a lot of perception with his injury, but I'm not sure how much that affected him in matches like this. It's just interesting to say that he certainly wasn't on top of his game in this one, but Owner and Keria in particular were definitely more than enough to be able to make up for it. And then for DK on the other side, dud of the series is going to go to Showmaker in the mid lane. I gave him player of the series earlier. He's going to get dud of the series here. It's actually his first of the summer split. He got quite a few of these in the spring split, but he can be a pretty volatile player, and he just had a relatively poor series. That Nico game, in particular in game 2, when you have Faker on the other side, who's been a little bit up and down in terms of the macro, especially on that LeBlanc game, you need to be able to take advantage of that, but it felt like Showmaker was consistently caught out alongside Faker, which is never a good thing to be. When the enemy team, has openings, it's never good for you to not be able to capitalize on them. And that's kind of how it felt, but it wasn't just him that was relatively useless. Bot lane continued to be relatively poor this week. I have the expectation that they're going to be able to bounce back, but Deft was doing negative damage towards the back half of game number 2 on the Kai'Sa, and Kellen just wasn't very good in general. A lot of those engages went pretty wide, and it's very difficult to play Rakan and Rel from, as far behind as they were, but it's worth pointing out, Kana got destroyed, and Canyon, like I said, really just didn't have a lot he could do in this series. There really wasn't anybody on DK that was worth celebrating in this one, and that's got to be a little bit frustrating for DK fans. They're very inconsistent, but this is a team that I think had aspirations of being one of the better teams in the entire league, and it just doesn't feel like they're anywhere close to that kind of expectation right now. Like I said earlier, it very much feels like a top 3 with T1 in it, and DK is not in that, and I think they'd have to be very disappointed with that being the case, but I just don't really see a lot of upward mobility for this team if they don't get more consistent. They're going to have performances that look really good like they did a couple of times this week, but they're also going to have performances that look bad against some of the top teams, and I think that's just what we're going to have to come to expect out of this team. And then for T1 on the other side, they're a good team. They may not be the best team in the LCK like the expectations were set at, but they're still a good team. It's going to be interesting to see how the rest of their week goes and how the rest of their season goes, obviously, with the news of Faker's injury, but for now, at least in this series, T1 looked very good, and they're definitely still one of the scarier teams in the world. Now we get to move on to day number 4, and we kick day 4 off with a battle between two teams near the bottom of the standings. We had OK BRION taking on DRX, and BRION picking up their second series victory of the split up until this point. They actually looked really good this week. I mean, dropping game 2 obviously isn't ideal, but DRX with a big win earlier this week against SANDBOX anyways, and so for Bro to be able to take this series off of them after actually looking relatively okay against Gen.G just in general, I think is massive for this team, and, you know, I'm going to be optimistic about them because I think that that's what's fair, that's what they deserve. They have earned the right for me to sit here and praise a lot of their players, but I do want to quell some excitement, and again, I know Bro Leavers are so passionate, especially in Twitch chat. They are incredibly fun, and they're a very vibrant community, but I do have to say, I am a little bit lower on this team than I think a lot of other people are. You'll see a lot of threads starting up after this week about how Bro's actually a really good team. They just need to get a couple of things together, and I guess in a relative sense, that's kind of true. They are, you know, they do need to get a couple of things together, and if they do that, I think they could be a relatively good team, but I think that's the case for almost every team in every major league. Like, that's such a blanket statement in my mind that it's kind of hard for it to mean anything. If you're not a good team, then you're not a good team. If you turn into a good team, then you're a good team. Like, a lot of teams are 2 or 3 adjustments away from being good. That doesn't make them good, you know what I mean? And so for Bro, it's just been a little bit frustrating because their decision making is so poor, and typically speaking, their late game team fighting has been a very big weakness, but they can be relatively good towards the early parts of games. I view them very similarly to how I view LGD over in the LPL, where it's just like, yeah, I guess this team has some talent, but I just don't think they're going to be able to put it together with this roster, and everybody knows I'm lower on LGD, and I know a lot of people are higher on LGD. I guess maybe everybody views those two teams very similarly, and I just view Bro differently. But let's talk about this series. I don't want it just to be all negative when it comes to them. Player of the series for me is going to go to Karis in the mid lane, and this is a major development for this team. He's looked instantly better ever since he came back into the lineup at the beginning of the week. Hopefully he can keep this up, because this is the best that he's ever looked in the LCK. This was not something he ever looked like on Hanwha. He never really had great games on Hanwha Life. He had a couple of good ones, but I wouldn't say he had great ones like he did on the Vigar here in game number 3. And he certainly didn't look like this on Bro at all any point this year, and so for him to get that little break, get that little hiatus, and be able to come back in and perform as well as he did in the first week, I think it's definitely a positive thing to watch for this team. If he can continue to be a positive, that does make Bro a lot better, and so really excited to see if that's going to be sustainable. I don't know if it is yet, because again, Karis has shown us a lot at the LCK level, and almost none of it has been very good, and so it's going to be interesting to see if he can keep being a good player, but that Vigar game in game 3 was phenomenal. That champion is still in a relatively good space, and I think he piloted it well. Everybody else in this team was playing well. Morgan obviously was great in that game 2 on his signature Renekton pick, much better than the series before. He was just better than Rascal basically for this whole series. Impressive to see. And then Henna and Effort looked pretty good as well. I think a lot of people are starting to heat up on Henna, and I think that that's fair. I think Henna is definitely an interesting player. I think if he was off of this Bro team, I would be a little bit more excited about him individually. I think he's fine as an AD carry. I think he's going to have moments where he looks good and moments where he looks bad, but especially when you're talking about some of the bottom AD carries in the LCK, I actually think that position is relatively shallow at the LCK level. I think the bottom, 3 or 4 AD carries in the league are just not very good, and, Henna has kind of been grouped into that for a while for me. I think I put him at number 7 in my pre-split power rankings, and that's just because I didn't trust anybody below him, but he's had some good games this split. I don't know if it will translate into anything, but he's played well. Effort has also played significantly better since the start of this split. He was really bad. He was my dud of the week in week number 1, but ever since then, I think he's been slowly getting better. I think this switch to, engaged supports as well as things like the Milio has helped him out a lot, and so for Bro, I just think they're playing well. I'm a little bit lower on their individual talent. I don't see players like Henna, and I especially don't see players like Umti and Effort being superstars. Like, I know a lot of people are high on them. I'm just not. I think they're relatively inoffensive, average players. So, players that aren't going to get you into playoffs in the LCK. You need better talent around them if that's going to be the case. But I think there is upside with players like Henna, and especially if Karis can hang on to the form that he showed this week, that could be big for Bro. And then for DRX on the other side, this team's okay. I don't want to worry too much, because again, Bro just looked kind of good in this series. It wasn't necessarily DRX looking miserable, but it is worth noting that Beryl had a really good series at the beginning of the week against SANDBOX, and we're like, oh my god, is Beryl actually going to start playing well? No, No, he followed that up with his worst series of the split. Up until this point, he was really bad. Like, he almost single-handedly lost a couple of games for this team in this series. Game number 3 was really, really bad for him. I mean, he was just running it down on his signature Ashe pick. Just not something that you want to see. Paddock was actually trying his best on this Varus to have any sort of pressure, and Beryl just completely shut it all down. And so a rough series from him. Fate was kind of a non-factor, but the top side was a little bit lost. Juhan ended up losing into the Skarner in game number 1, which is really funny to say the least. And then obviously just didn't really have a ton of pressure in that final game of the series. Bro was able to get that early lead, and they never really looked back. That's Juhan. He's just not a superstar. I've been saying it again. He proves it every time. I know people really want to love him, and people really want to, create this narrative that he's the savior of DRX and that he's going to come in and turn the team around. He's just not that kind of player. And those expectations I don't think are particularly fair to him. I've been saying that for a long time. And then Rascal in the top lane, he's just fine. Again, he's just fine. He's not playing at his best. I think he can get back to his best form. He's been in better form as of recent, but getting gapped by Morgan, as good as Morgan has been, he's certainly not been a bad top laner. I just don't think it's the situation you want to see for Rascal in 2023. DRX kind of coming off of a very big win for them with a pretty heart-crushing loss. This was a series they probably should have been able to win, and they weren't able to come out with the win. But congratulations and credit to Brion. This team is interesting. I do think that they're still towards the bottom of the LCK standings. I'm not going to overreact again. This team has a couple of games every split where it's like, oh my god, are they good? And then they immediately go back to being bad. And so I don't want to pretend like this is going to be anything different. If they can sustain this over the course of a couple of games, then yeah, I'm going to start to rethink them. But, in just one series against a DRX team that has known to struggle, like, I'm not going to overreact. Moving on to our second series of day number 4 now, and we've got another very intriguing one that I was very, very interested to see because of the ramifications. We had Liiv SANDBOX taking on the Kwangdong Freecs, and we finally get this matchup that we've been waiting for, and KDF actually is able to deliver. They're able to take down SANDBOX, the team that has basically stopped them from being in the top 6 all year long, and they've come and proved that, you know what, we're better. We're better than you, and you're on this big downward trajectory, and we have continued to get better over the course of this year, and this is where we are now. We are at the point now where we can not only beat you, but beat you incredibly convincingly in 2-0 fashion, with both games being relatively in our favor, although game number 2 certainly had its moments, but KDF looking really, really good in this one, and it's the same players, it's the same stories that I've told you all split long. It continues to be a major factor for them. Player of the series, again, goes to Dudu in the top lane. At this point, like, no one can be sleeping on him anymore. He is a top 3, at worst, top laner in the LCK. I mean, he has been phenomenal over the course of this year, and I was already super high on him last year coming out of Hanwha Life. Talked about it a ton. You can go back and check out my 2022 coverage or even my preseason 2023 coverage where I was talking about Dudu as like one of the most hard-stuck players last year in the LCK. Was playing super well for a Hanwha Life team that just didn't matter, right? I compared him a lot to Morgan. I felt like those two players were very similar, although I felt Dudu was kind of the better version, and I think that is definitely kind of panned out. But put him on a team where he can actually get a lot of resources and the rest of the map can actually unlock. Like, he's legit been one of the best players in the LCK. And man, is that fun to say, and man, is that fun to watch. Hopefully he can keep this up. I don't know if KDF is ever going to turn into like this fantastic team, if they're ever going to be able to build around this young nucleus that they've been able to generate, but Dudu's a player that needs to be playing on like an LCK title contender right now. Like, he really is that good, and I think he continues to prove it. Teamfight Fiora, I mean, come on, like, he's dominating on things that he really has no right to dominate on. And we'll talk about Bertle in a bit. He didn't necessarily play well at all in this series, and SANDBOX in general just feels like they're losing every bit of momentum that they've been able to generate. But Dudu was great. Bulldog continues to be a really big factor for this team. Really nice LeBlanc game in game number 1. I don't think he's been nearly as much of a standout as he was in spring, mostly because I think a lot of the attention is rightfully going to Dudu in the top lane, who has just been this team's best player over the course of this year. But Bulldog is still a very big piece for why this team is moving up. I think the solo lanes are definitely the strength, and Youngjae, to his credit, I think is a pretty consistent jungler. He's never going to be fantastic, but he's never going to be the problem either, and I think that is good for a team that does have some carries and does have players that you can play through relatively efficiently. And then you've got Taiyun and June in the bot lane, and usually I'm talking like, okay, well, top side did well, bot side didn't do well. That's kind of been the KDF formula, but Taiyun actually had a much better series here. Was still a little bit over-aggressive, especially on that Kai'Sa, going in and just dying in a couple of circumstances, but at least he was getting out a lot of damage in these fights, and that's all that really matters. Like, you can be an aggressive AD carry, you can die for the fight, as long as you're chunking 2 or 3 or 4 members of the team before you die. That's super worth it in a lot of cases. I've talked about that a ton on the channel, and Taiyun was doing that in this series. You just have to make those plays count. And I think he did. It's just the consistency with him. Again, he's had good games in the past. He's had really bad games in the past. It's all going to be about which one you get more of, and that's really going to determine his LCK future. And then June is just fine. I don't think he's a game changer. I don't think he's, like, bad either. I think he's just relatively fine. But the solo laners are really what's going to push this team across the finish line if they do end up getting towards the top of the standings. And at least in this series, they looked pretty damn good. And then for SANDBOX on the other side, this team has completely fallen apart. Like, I think even the biggest SANDBOX detractors couldn't have guessed that they were going to be this bad in summer. It feels like they have absolutely no synergy together. A lot of the players that were playing really well and kind of showed that they continued to be, you know, risers in spring, players like Bertle, players like Willer, players like Kale, you know, they're just completely gone. Like, they are, any good things that they are doing have been completely nullified. Dud of the series is going to go to Bertle. You could very realistically give this to Kale in the support position. Both have been really bad over the course of this split, and I cannot explain it. I really can't, because, you know, Bertle's had bad moments in the past. I'm not going to pretend like he's been only good throughout his LCK career, but I thought he was really good in spring. One of the more consistent top laners in the entire league. A big reason why SANDBOX won a lot of games towards the beginning of the split, especially, but he's just been very meh over the course of this split. And then Kale, like, this one is completely unexplainable. Like, I don't even think you can pretend on this one. He's been phenomenal, and he's been phenomenal with a bunch of different AD carries, and that's how you know he's a good player, right? Is he's been given a bunch of different players to have to deal with, including Envy, who's really struggling on LGD right now, and he's looked great in every single circumstance. He's made every single ADC that he's played with look better, and now he's given an actually good ADC. Not that Prince wasn't, right? I'm simplifying things, but he's given Teddy, who is more than stable, and it just doesn't work, right? For whatever reason, it's just not working between the two, and Kale has been very bad as well. Closer's not been very good, although inconsistently he's been fine. Willer has taken major steps back. He's losing the early game, which he basically never did in the spring split, and, you know, Teddy's consistent, I guess, in the case where he's not really giving over a ton of resources, and he is dealing damage, but Teddy's not the kind of player that can be your best player and you still win. Like, that's never going to happen. It's not really who Teddy is as a player, and so for SANDBOX, they're really struggling. This is a team that not only is in danger of missing the playoffs, which again was, you know, not really on their radar going into the split. They felt pretty locked, I imagine, with how the league ended up playing out in spring and with their additions, but they're in danger of being like a bottom 2 team in the LCK, which I just don't think a lot of people saw coming. So very bad series from SANDBOX and a very bad week in general from SANDBOX, but for KDF on the other side, you just got to be excited. This team probably is a playoff team in the current form. There aren't a lot of teams that are super consistent in the LCK right now, and I think their upside definitely warrants them being in that conversation, and especially if their solo laners are going to continue to be this good, like, they could be a very, very scary playoff team to run into in round 1. And then moving on to our final day of action here in the LCK in week number 4, and it is a good one as we kicked it off with Gen.G taking on Hanwha Life Esports, and Gen.G is going to be able to pick up the win. They moved to 8-0 to start the split. They moved to 16-3 in game score. Absolutely ridiculous. Like, I mean, there is no team that you could have expected to be this dominant in the LCK. They really have just been better than everybody else that they've played. Even, like, most of their series have just been 2-0 wins. It's actually absurd how good they are and just how well a lot of these players are clicking at the current moment. I think their synergy is a big reason why they're being pushed forward. I think they're obviously all individually incredibly talented players, but they all make each other better as well. Like I talked about, their coordination and their team fight prowess is really what is the strength of this team, and I think it really does show in the fact that there really aren't a lot of teams that are going to have nearly as good a macro as they do, and it's really, really impressive stuff. Big ups to them. Player of the series for me, pretty obviously in this one, is going to go to Pays on Gen.G. Man, it's ridiculous how good he gets, right? Like, when he is enabled, when the rest of the team is clicking, and when they're all winning in the early game, and they just kind of, like, give him resources, he turns those resources into wins. Like, he is, like, a factory for wins when you give him the things that he needs. He's 17 years old. Like, are you kidding me? It's insane how good he is. He's got to be the front runner to win MVP in the LCK right now. I mean, and that's ridiculous. Like, that's absurd. He should never be in that position, but he is, because he really is that damn good. The Xayah was great in game 1. The Aphelios was even better in game 2. His gun rotation is perfect. His positioning is immaculate. He's so proactive in the mid game. He plays off of his support incredibly well in the laning phase. He just does everything that you want him to do. He has very quickly become one of the best AD carries in the entire world, and I don't know how much longer we can deny that. You know, obviously, we're going to see what happens when he's really tested. Going up against Hanwha, a team that really is struggling at the current moment, a jungler that isn't necessarily there to punish in the same way that maybe some of the best teams in the world will. It's going to be interesting to see how Paze holds up, but he was pretty good at MSI, and he's been phenomenal, even better ever since he came back. And so, if he only continues to get better, we could be talking about him by the end of the year as, like, maybe the best AD carry in the world. Like, that really is his upside. He could carry Gen.G to a world title if everything goes right, but he won't have to carry them because the rest of this team is pretty damn good in their own right. They still have Peanut and Chovy on this roster who are still phenomenal. Chovy's been great all split long. It's almost funny how much how under the radar I think he's going because of how good Paze has been, and yes, Paze has been phenomenal, but Chovy is also an MVP candidate in my opinion for how good he has been. Delight has really stepped it up. Obviously, I've been a little bit lower on him individually in terms of what he's been able to do. I just kind of am on Gen.G supports, I guess. Kind of funny how that ends up working out because I was on Lehens last year as well, but man, him and Paze work off of each other incredibly well, and he's probably been the most consistent support in the entire LCK outside of Lehens, probably, who's just been phenomenal. And then Doran and Peanut are also really good players. It's not like they're weak links by any means. I've hyped them both up a lot, not only this split, but previous splits as well. Gen.G is just a complete disaster to have to run into in terms of other teams. Nobody wants to play this team, and I think it's pretty clear why. And then for Hanwha on the other side, a lot of things are going wrong for them right now. I want to give them at least a little bit of time to figure things out because, again, a lot happened this week for this organization, for a lot of these players. A lot was thrust upon them, and they didn't really have a lot of time to kind of react and adapt to any of the changes that had to be made. Grizzly coming in was obviously not great for the rest of the team. Zeka in particular, I think, has really struggled because of, you know, the lack of jungle synergy there, but it can't be good on Grizzly either. It's not like he was preparing for an LCK debut. He was just kind of put in this position where all of a sudden now he's playing in the LCK, and that's never really a great position to be in. There are a couple of players that I do need to see step up more consistently, though. Dead of the series for me is going to go to Liiv in the support position. He's been a pretty big negative for Hanwha all split long, which is kind of surprising. He's been very good over the course of his career, and I honestly thought he was really good last year on KT Rolster. He was a big reason, in my opinion, why that team was kind of surprising towards the back half of the year, and so to see him pair up with someone like Viper and kind of just hold him back and be kind of a negative towards the team all year long, it's just surprising. It never felt like he was on the right page with the rest of the team, and it very much felt like a lot of his engages were going wide and they weren't at great times. Viper still continues to be this team's best player by a significant margin, but if Zeka doesn't step up, they're probably not going to win. That really is just kind of Hanwha life. We talk about this. Viper's going to be good. I feel pretty confident about that, but when Zeka, you know, steps up and plays well, this team wins, which is why they've won quite a bit this split, but when he isn't stepping up and when he doesn't have that great connection with this jungler, this team's probably going to lose because they rely on him a lot as that primary or secondary carry. Kingan's been whatever on the top side, but Grizzly certainly hasn't stepped in and been remarkable. He was far from the biggest problem on the team, in my opinion, but he certainly isn't doing a lot of good plays, and, you know, as far as we know, he's not really taken over a lot of the shot-calling duties that Klid left behind, and so for Hanwha, they've just got to hopefully figure some stuff out. Hopefully they have the time to be able to get these players used to each other, because at least the synergy right now just doesn't feel good enough. And then for Gen.G on the other side, they're so dominant. This team, I don't want to say could go 18-0, but, like, it's possible. They are that damn good. They definitely have the talent to be able to pull it off, but at the very least, this is the best team in the LCK right now, and one of the best teams in the world, right up there, in my opinion, with JDG and BLG. And that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in week number 4 of the LCK, and it is a little bit of an interesting one, as we had NS RedForce taking on T1. And T1 is going to be able to walk out of here with the 2-1 series win, but it certainly wasn't as clean as it should have been. NS actually looking relatively good in this series, or I guess more specifically, T1 kind of giving a lot of advantages over to their opponents, but it's still up to the enemy team to be able to capitalize on those, you know, advantages that T1 was kind of giving to them, and a lot of teams just aren't going to be able to do that at a high level. So good to see NS actually show up and, you know, feel comfortable to try and play this game. There are a lot of teams and players that would just see T1 on the radar, on the opposing part of the schedule, and just be like, nah, you know, we're probably not going to win this one, especially when you're 1-6, but NS showed up today, and you got to give them a lot of credit for that. But for T1, they are still able to walk out of this with a win, and a lot of it is due to one player in particular, and that's going to be Zeus in the top lane. He was phenomenal in this game. I mean, in both of these games, games 2 and 3, he basically 1v9'd. I'm not going to say he was the only player on the team to be playing well, because I think Gumayushi in particular was also really good, but man, Zeus was the guy that was starting everything for this team. You got to give him a lot of credit. Again, I know people like to hate on Zeus. They like to say that he's a choker in the big time, but He was a really, really good player last year. He was the best top laner in the world through the regular season, in my opinion. And then even when you look at Worlds, like, yes, he had a couple of bad games and he wasn't particularly great in finals, but go look at the semifinals in particular, that series against JD Gaming, where he just completely gapped 369 and made him look completely irrelevant. On something like a Yone, he looked really, really good on it. And so Zeus is still a player that I think can perform at high levels. I think he's just getting a lot of criticism, and I think he's letting a lot of the criticism get to him in those big moments. Hopefully he can figure that out mentally, because that's the only problem. It's just mental for him. We know he can be good enough to be the best top laner in the world. Like, that's always going to be Zeus's upside. He can be a top 5 player in the world, and it could be pretty fun to watch, but hopefully he can get there. This was a really, really good showing that it's definitely still there and not gone. Gumayushi, like I said, was also really good in this series. He really has the potential to be one of the best AD carries in the world, like, now, and he might be, like, already. Obviously, he was first team All-Pro in the LCK last split. That, to me, is one of the best AD carries in the world, but he almost doesn't get the same kind of attention as players like Viper, as players like Pays in the LCK, because he's really not the focal point for what T1 wants to do. He's been given more of an increased role this split, and he's done brilliantly with it. I just think he's a phenomenal player. Mechanically speaking, he's right up there with anybody else, not only in the LCK, but in the world, and I think he continues to show that. If he was on a different team, I think we would definitely consider him in that conversation, but because he's surrounded by such unbelievable talent, I think sometimes we lose sight of how good Gumayushi actually is. But ironically, the rest of this team was a little bit shaky. Again, Faker is injured, so I don't want to talk about it too much. He was pretty up and down across this series. He was still relatively fine, but a couple of bad moments. But Owner and Keria were definitely questionable. Owner in particular in that game number 3. The pathing on the Vi was really bad. He was actually really far behind in the early game. Couple of really bad engages from him. None of it really mattered because T1 was super far ahead by the time they got to the late game, and the Vi engages ended up working out. But Owner, I think, definitely had a little bit rougher of a performance than he did earlier in the week. And then Keria had a couple of games where I thought he was relatively up and down as well. Sometimes when you play Rel, those engages are going to work, and sometimes when you play Rel, those engages aren't going to work, and that was kind of the case. But Zeus and Guma kind of pushing them across the line. And then for Nongshim, like I said, they actually played well. Jiwoo continues to look really good for this team. There is a rumor that, and it's not a rumor, I think, at this point, by the time this video goes out, you guys know Jiwoo's getting replaced. He's getting benched, and Vital's going to be back in the lineup. I think that's a massive mistake. I think Jiwoo has been easily the best player that Nongshim has had in the year of 2023, and it's crazy to me that he's going to be taken out. I think he's a big upside piece for them. Fiesta had a couple of good moments, also had a couple of really, really bad moments. Very high-risk, high-reward playstyle from him in this series, and oftentimes it didn't work. But some negatives. Peter, again, pretty rough week for him overall. Not an awful one, but just a little bit of a rough one. And then dud of the series for me is going to go to Din Din. It was a pretty massive top gap, in my opinion, this series. And Din Din, for my money, is the worst top laner in the LCK at the current moment. I just haven't really seen anything that makes me feel particularly excited about him. And I feel like I say that every single time I bring him up, and nothing has really changed. He's just kind of there for me, and hopefully he can get better. I know a lot of people, again, see upside in him. It just hasn't necessarily come to me, I guess, yet. I haven't seen that upside. Sylvie has not been particularly good. He was okay in this series, but again, lost a lot of pressure towards the back half of these games. Really struggled to keep up a lot of the pressure that he was able to create in the early game, especially in that game 3 on the Sejuani. So overall for Nongshim, again, they're going to be talked about in a similar way to Bro, where it's like, oh, this would be a good team if they fixed this and this and this. Well, yeah, they got to fix that and that and that. You know what I mean? There are too many errors on this team for me to consider them a good team just because they're able to take a game off of T1. A lot of teams have been able to take a game off of T1. Even last split, when this team looked relatively unbeatable, they would lose game 1s all the time. That's what T1 does. And so, again, very similar to what I said about Bro, I'm not going to overreact to Nongshim. They looked good in this series, but not good enough to be able to pull out the W. And then for T1, this team's fine. Obviously, with Faker's injury, it's hard to really evaluate their performances this week, knowing that he was not at his best, but a couple of good performances. Zeus was phenomenal. I think Owner obviously had a great series earlier this week, but Guma really stepped up. T1 has some really good players. They don't just need Faker to step up and do everything. They are a very complete team, and hopefully that can continue throughout the rest of the year. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK Week 4 overview and analysis of all 5 days. Up on the screen now, you're going to see the updated standings after 4 weeks of action. Any ties will just be broken alphabetically. Only a couple of those left here in the LCK. Of course, in the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings after week number 4. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week, so we can go over the risers and the fallers. Top 6 now is pretty solidified in my mind. Gen.G, KT, T1, DK, HLE, that's top 5. I feel like that's pretty indisputable at this point. Maybe HLE continues to fall if their roster continues to not really mesh as well together, but until they prove that they're worse than any of the teams below that, that's the top 5 in the LCK. And then officially, we have a newcomer to the top 6, probably for the first time all year long. The Kwangdong Freecs are entering the top 6. They officially have earned it. They beat Liiv SANDBOX. They showed that they definitely are better than them, and so they jump up into the top 6. Incredibly excited to have them in there now. It looks like those are going to be your 6 playoff teams unless there's some major happening over the back half of the split. We're not even halfway through, but really it does feel like a top half and a bottom half in the league at the current moment. KDF definitely on the barrier, but for now they feel pretty good, and especially with those 2 solo laners clicking, 6 feels pretty right for them. SANDBOX is only going to drop to 7 for now. Honestly, I could see them dropping lower this week for a lot of other people, but for me, they're only going to go to 7 because I do feel like they have enough talent to be able to bounce back. Hopefully they're going to be able to live up to that. And then for me, bottom 3 are just going to stay bottom 3 for now. Bro jumps up because they were able to beat DRX and they looked good against Gen.G, but I still don't really believe in this team more than number 8, more than bottom 3 in my opinion. And then DRX and Nongshim both falling down 1. DRX actually looked relatively okay this week. I think you can, make the case that DRX is 8 and that Bro is 9, but Bro just beat DRX. And so, whatever you want to say there, I think Nongshim is pretty clearly number 10 at the current moment in the power rankings. 1-7, lost their last 7 games. Not particularly good, but overall, those are my power rankings. Let me know who I'm too high on and who I'm too low on down in the comment section below. Of course, I don't expect you to have the exact same opinion as me, so I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions, of course, in a respectful and, I guess, more discussion-oriented way. But now we get to move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week here in week number 4. My player of the week going to go to somebody who's already gotten it this year. It's going to go to Pays, the 80 carry for Gen.G. He just continues to be phenomenal. I mean, he absolutely destroyed this week, and Gen.G continues to be unstoppable. They're 8-0, plus 13. They're really just really, really good right now. There really is not a lot of negative things you can say about him. He has been phenomenal, and he's currently my leader for MVP. You should probably note that for the fact that there's been 4 weeks of the season, and he's gotten 2 player of the weeks up until this point. Pays has been phenomenal. And then dud of the week for me, again, kind of a tough choice, but at the end of the day, it was pretty easy to settle on it. My dud of the week is going to go to Kale, the support for Liiv SANDBOX. It's really sad to give him that, because obviously, I'm one of the biggest Kale supporters in the world. I was really, really excited about him last year in particular with Prince. I thought he was a very underrated part of that Liiv SANDBOX team, and he was really good with Envy in the spring split as well. I was talking about him as a world-class support who, legitimately could, make a team a world's team if he were, in that situation, but things have just completely fallen apart so far in summer. And so for me, Kale's going to get dud of the week in week 4. I also considered Zeka. He was considered for player of the week in both weeks 2 and 3, and now he's considered for dud of the week in week 4. Maybe he'll actually win an award sometime this year, but it's funny the dichotomy of going back and forth between that. But for me, dud of the week in week 4 was Kale, and player of the week in week 4 was Pays. But that is going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, leave a like on this video if you did enjoy it. It really lets me know that you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about the LCK every single week on this channel. Not only the LCK, but all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL weekly on this channel. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything happening in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit the subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.